yeah, let's jump into the first question here, which comes from David Stewart, who is always asking good questions every month. And this time David is asking, and how had an opening line for my opponent this past week, week 7 in the Dojo Liga. Shout out to the Dojo Liga, our weekly team Classical League, that he didn't understand. And David feels like he didn't come out of the opening well as a result. So d4, d6, let's put it on the board. c4 was knight f6, knight f3, c6. All right, and is the Catalan style fianchetto still a viable plan for white? What is black going for, and how do I best counter those plans? How do I best go about developing the queenside pieces harmoniously? Yeah, absolutely. Good question, David. So let's talk about this one. So here we had an interesting move order. We had d4, d6, c4, knight f6, knight f3, and here black goes c6. So in general, when black is playing already with d6, and then yeah, especially with c6, knight f6, it kind of feels like they're trying to do like a philidor type of setup, like knight d7 and e5. This is often known as the Old Indian as well, when the bishop goes to e7. If the bishop goes to g7, then it's more of a King's Indian type of position, of course. So when black plays with d6, it can be kind of flexible, so they can still play the King's Indian, and then they can still also play the Old Indian and put the bishop on e7. So yeah, in general, playing against this opening, I think the fianchetto setup is absolutely fine. Like against the King's Indian, this is one of the most common setups nowadays, and a lot of players really like this one for white, because when you put your own bishop on g2, you're a lot more protected against black's possible kingside attack. Doesn't mean you never get checkmated here as white. You don't, or there are no tactics or anything like that. It can still be like very sharp and dynamic, but a lot of players like this one because they feel like their king is safer on g1. And generally, I would say this does kind of lead to more positional battles against the King's Indian compared to your main lines, which can, just turn into absolute chaotic positions. So this one I think is absolutely fine against all of these kind of random setups that black can choose as well. So whether they play with like knight d7 here, or with c6 first, and then something like knight to d7, white can definitely go for this kind of setup. And yeah, in general, we'll be putting our knight on c3, and eventually, let's say black just continues kind of developing normally. Eventually, we do want to capture the center with the move e4. I think this is kind of one of white's main ideas with the fianchetto setup. There are other ways of playing the positions as well. Playing e4 is definitely not the only kind of plan in this type of position. It also makes sense to try and use your bishop on the diagonal and leave the diagonal open, and then try to play for more of like a b4, b5 plan. When you go rook to b1, b4, b5, of course white's going to castle, and then you try to exert pressure on this diagonal. So this is also very, very typical when we're playing with a fianchetto setup. Especially a lot of players, they like to start with c4 if they're going to be playing a fianchetto against everything, because this kind of already carves out some light squares for the bishop. And a lot of times, starting with c4, we end up in these kinds of fianchetto positions where white's main idea is to just fight for all the light squares in the long run. So yeah, basically to answer the question, the fianchetto variation is absolutely fine. In terms of developing the queen side, well, the knight's going to c3. We know that much. And it can be kind of tricky to figure out what to do with this dark square bishop. A lot of players end up just playing bishop g5 and just trading it off because they don't know what else to do with it. It seems to get into the way. But another very typical thing that I would say is maybe more ambitious is to just play for a double fianchetto and put the bishop on b2. I would say that's very, very common here for white when you're playing with like one fianchetto. Often the other bishop just doesn't have a better spot than b2, and then both bishops kind of act like policemen when they're putting pressure all over the board on the diagonal. So yeah, long story short, this is fine pretty much against everything. And just quickly in terms of the move order, when black starts with d6, I would suggest to just play knight f3 right away, because with d6 actually black can play for an early e5, and this can actually be pretty good. In fact, Jesse's a big fan of this one. If white just plays c4 here and black goes e5, it's actually perfectly reasonable for black this position. And then there's some sharp ideas where on knight f3 they want to go e4, and this can get kind of messy out of the opening. So a lot of players here, if you're just going to play knight f3, it makes sense to do it on move 2, because this kind of prevents black from being able to play e5 without first kind of having to develop and support it. So yeah, that would be like the only kind of move order thing I would say is like, all right, start with knight f3 against d6, so you prevent a quick e5, and then from here you can stick to your fianchetto setup. You can play c4, this knight can go to c3 or sometimes d2. But yeah, the main thing to always keep in mind here is just that, you know, it's a space advantage. That's kind of what's happening in this position. Let's say we get like a King's Indian, something like this. You know, I would say here white should be trying to play e4 and just capture the center. And this is pretty much, I think, what white should be trying to do, honestly, from move 1. Like when white's playing d4, black goes d6. Essentially, since black is not putting a pawn on d5 in the opening, they're kind of giving up the battle for the e4 square. In fact, white can play e4 right here. It's probably objectively the best move. But even if white, you know, develops in a different way, like c4, knight c3, or like this fianchetto thing we're looking at, essentially white is always going to be able to win the fight for the e4 square. And that's why, like, a very, very typical plan, regardless of how black is, let's say, playing the opening, they can choose many different setups here. Let's say they castle first, castles, then e5, something like this. In most of these positions, I think the main thing white should be doing is just playing e4, capturing the center, taking space. Now, you don't have to keep pushing with d5 and grabbing all the space. In fact, with the bishop on g2, a lot of times it actually makes sense to kind of keep the center more flexible. And here, actually, I would recommend just supporting the center in a sample position like this: h3, bishop b3, queen d2, bringing the rooks in, and just kind of keeping the tension and always allowing black to be able to take on d4 so you can recapture, and then the bishop is still going to be somewhat useful on this diagonal. So yeah, that's kind of like the long story short here, is that white is going to have a space advantage, and you basically have to wield it. You know, I was thinking like the space advantage, it's kind of an interesting thing. Cool thing about chess is like you can give your opponent a certain type of advantage and it might not be such a big deal, because of course black like willingly walks into this playing like the King's Indian or any of these other openings. Yeah, it's kind of an interesting thing. Like when you have a space advantage, you know, it's like wielding like a big heavy weapon. If you don't exactly know what to do with it, it might end up actually making your fighting less effective, versus someone who has like a small weapon, but they know exactly like how to wield it, and they know exactly like how to poke you and where to poke. Like here, black knows like, all right, they're going to put the knight on c5, and they got the e5 square, and they're going to look at the dark squares, and they got a5, a4. So like when you know the position, you kind of know the plans, even if you're slightly worse, right, you might still be able to outplay the opponent. Happens all the time. So having this space advantage, right, it's kind of like responsibility. You still have to be able to manage it properly. But someone who's like really big and strong, holding a big weapon that they know how to use, yeah, they're gonna beat like the pokey guy every time, right? So someone like Magnus or Kramnik who like really knows how to like use a space advantage and squeeze their opponents to death, right? They're always gonna win that battle in the long run. So that's what makes these positions so playable for both sides. But from White's point of view, yeah, this is what we want to do. We want to take the space, try to hold on to the space, try to restrict our opponent's counterplay, slowly improve our position, and yeah, eventually try to transform our strategic advantage into something more tangible, material advantage, attack on the king, winning endgame, something like that. Okay, David, hopefully that answers the question. Yeah, wish you the best of luck with these lines. Let's go to the next one here, which comes from Kirk. I scrolled too far. There we go. Let me adjust it a little bit more. Oh, not too much, folks. I'm really, really sorry for this. Oh, almost. We almost got it. Yeah, it's not going to be perfect. It is. Oh man, it's so close. All right, that's good enough. That's good enough. Okay, next question comes from Kirk, who has been asking a lot of questions lately about e4, e5. So we're continuing our e4, e5 series here. All right, Kirk is asking about the classical Italian. So let's put this line on the board. It was e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop c4, bishop c5, c3, knight f6, d4, e takes d4, and now castles. So this, Kirk says, seems to be turning from a Greco attack. I remember last month we had a question on this one exactly, with me giving some of the details behind the history of this line with takes and bishop b4 check and all these fun lines with knight c3, knight takes c4, and castles. So that happened on the last episode of this series. But here we're asking about 6-move castles, which seems to be turning this one into Scotch Gambit, but with some small differences. Against the Scotch, I played d6, but I don't have the feeling it works that well here. Knight takes e4 or d takes c3 seem to be other options. So what would you recommend? Yeah, so good question. So yeah, first of all, let me just say, right, like if Black played d6 here, which I think maybe looks natural to a lot of players and not really, actually let's flip the board so we see it from Black's point of view. So not wanting to deal with White's gambit or take any of these pawns. If Black does this, then they're actually really, I think, kind of dropping the ball in the opening, because then White is able to recapture on d4 with the pawn, get this very, very strong and perfect center, get the tempo on the bishop. Here Black doesn't have any kind of bishop b4 check ideas or anything like that, has to drop back. And now minimum White can just play knight c3 here and have both pawns defended, and White would just have a very, very clear advantage. And this could get ugly real quick. Bishop g5, knight d5, like this is very, very dangerous from Black's point of view. So yeah, that's the thing about playing e4, e5. It's that White can really kind of dictate the pace sometimes. Like if they want to sacrifice the pawn, right? Like sometimes you kind of have to take it. Yeah, I looked at this one a bit. I actually don't think it's that scary. I remember, I think, trying to analyze this from White's point of view to see if there was any kind of surprise value here. But I think if Black just knows like one or two details, it's really not that dangerous of a line. Of course, more popular, as most people probably know, c takes d4 here, as well as e5. e5, I would say, is maybe the most solid option of them all, because White isn't actually going to be sacrificing a pawn here. Generally on e5, like Black goes d5, White plays bishop b5. Okay, very typical idea. I think most e4, e5 players know the importance of the d5 counter thrust, which saves black in almost every single line. So here white goes bishop b5 because they don't want to give up the light square bishop. Black jumps in knight e4 because they carved out this square. And then white can recapture the pawn on d4 with c takes d4. So this position actually, I mean, very, very topical nowadays at like higher levels. But anyway, we'll say that maybe for next month. But yeah, this one definitely more common. So what's wrong with white just castling here? Yeah, I think this works great if you don't think your opponent is gonna grab the pawn or go d takes c3 here. But yeah, if they play knight takes e4, then I really don't think there's a lot here for white. So generally the idea is for black to just play d5 next move, like rook e1, queen e2. Like black wants to go d5, support the knight, get ready to castle, develop the bishop, hit the bishop on c4, and solve their problems. So the main thing to, I think, know here is that if white plays c takes d4, which is kind of the main move, then you should probably go d5 here anyway. And this is probably the thing that I think would be very hard to, let's say, figure out yourself over the board, especially in like a blitz game, right? If you're not super familiar with this position. Of course, the instinct would be to just like drop the bishop back. But the problem with this, as you might guess, is that like, well, white gets the chance to play d5, and then this knight doesn't get the support it needs, and this could turn ugly very, very quick. And here for one pawn, white could have a ton of compensation. So very important for black to have this counter thrust in mind with d5. And now I think it's basically critical for white to take here. If they move the bishop, we'll move our bishop, and essentially we'll be fine here with the extra pawn. So white's got to take this one on c5. We take this one on c4. And yeah, black's still a pawn up. We're not really super invested in keeping the extra pawn. We still just kind of want to equalize as black. So if white, let's say, goes into the endgame with queen takes d8, king takes d8, we're absolutely fine here. In fact, I'm not even sure white's gonna even get the pawn back because c5 is going to be under pressure as well. So this endgame, I think, is absolutely fine for black. If anything, black is better. So generally white is going to try some move like queen e2 or queen e1 or something like this. Yeah, these aren't too dangerous. You can look at the database, analyze a bit with the engine here to kind of prep it deeper if you want, but essentially black is fine. There's a couple of moves here like queen d3 has been played a lot, and some games with like rook e1, and then black playing f5 here. And then eventually castling, like a very common way this opening might proceed, is like knight c3, castles. Let's say white takes everything on e4. White gets the pawn back, but black gets their pieces out, and is not worse really at all in this position. I mean, I think the engine will give something like close to equal, but yeah, it also just optically looks totally fine for black. Yeah, I would say this one is solid. I also, turned on the engine here and it gave queen e7 as being maybe even better for black, or if you're playing a lower rated player and you want to maybe keep some more fight on the board, this could be a good one, with the idea to just give the pawn back on c4, but play bishop f5 and just get the pieces out, maybe castle queenside somewhere here. And yeah, this could definitely be a little bit more challenging for white to deal with, despite like the somewhat symmetrical structure. Is like opposite color bishops and tons of pieces on the board, maybe even opposite sides castling coming. So yeah, this could be a fun position. I think black is more or less fine. So yeah, I don't think there's really a ton of danger here. I think you can just play knight takes e4 and then go d5. And yeah, it's kind of the main trick you got to know, that on cd4 you just play d5 anyway. And takes, and queen goes to d3 or queen e7, and yeah, black is essentially doing fine here. I really didn't see much danger. Okay, Rook Handler had a question. Had a more general French advanced Rook Handler, you were just making fun of us for doing opening content, and now you're asking opening question. I see how it is. Okay, yeah, that's fine. You're just teasing us for Jesse. Obviously, we think studying openings is more important at higher levels. The problem is there's too many people doing it at lower levels, and it's not really helping them. Okay, so the question was about knight f3, about this one, this position. So you're playing bishop d7, but you're wondering if you should try the c4 stuff. Yeah. Actually, let me hide Kirk's question so people don't get confused. Yeah, the c4 stuff is kind of tough to play. I mean, if you really like close positions, then you can do this one. But I think you mean like this one, right? Like queen b6 first, then white goes a3, and then c4 here, right? Because normally we play it once white has given up the b3 square. Yeah, I mean, this one I played a couple times. If you don't mind the super close position, it is very playable. You have this plan like knight a5, bishop d7, bring this other knight over to b6. I even remember it because I used to play this line, and then the bishop goes to a4. So one knight goes to a5, the other knight goes to b6, bishop goes to a4, and then you try to, your dream is to try to get h6, bishop c2, bishop h7. If you get that, then you're clearly better. So, this one is playable, but it's tough. I mean, I don't know. Eventually I got sick of playing these like super close positions as a French player. I'm not really up to date on the advance. I honestly have no idea what black should do against it. Because yeah, when I was playing the French, the advanced variation was like, I was happy to see it. I was just like, oh, the advance is great because you get so much play. But okay, now things are a little bit different. Now space advantage is definitely starting to count more. Yeah, so you can try it, but it's definitely not for everyone. Pixie Nixie. Side question from Grunfeld player. Is it worth it to add a Benoni / King's Indian line versus the G3 setup as well? Yeah, I mean, as usual, it just kind of depends. Like, if you're not happy with the Grunfeld playing against the Fianchetto, then yeah, play King's Indian or play c5. Absolutely. But it just kind of depends, you know. I mean, you don't have to. I mean, Grunfeld is very solid, but yeah, if you don't love like the symmetrical Grunfeld or whatever, then absolutely you can try King's Indian or something more dynamic. Okay. Okay, and then Foos just had a related question. How should white play in the line they're trying to avoid? What do you mean exactly? So, say taking say c6 here. You mean something like this? Yeah. Well, I mean, this one is as far as I know, I mean, this is still like one of the most solid things black can do. So I think it's like playable for white, but yeah, I don't know if there's like a clear anything established here for white. Like, there's multiple different lines, but I think black is fine essentially everywhere. It's very drawish. But it's not like fun for black. It's kind of boring for black, so I never really liked it. But Yeah, so white has tries like b3, or maybe it's like some early queen a4s, or okay, taking is very common and then going like knight e5. But yeah, essentially against all of them, I think black is supposed to be kind of patiently equalizing. Like it's not the most fun thing, but it is pretty solid. But you maybe could try, I'm sure you could find some kind of setup that kind of works for you, because it's not also, I mean, it's just like a positional game. I would say it's similar to like kind of like, you know, almost like London system or like Tory attack, where it's equal, is very close to equal, but you know, white has like slightly more pleasant something, and you know, it's a little bit harder for black to find the good moves than it is for white, essentially. But yeah, as far as I understand, there's nothing really super special here for white. I think Kramnik did something like crazy one time. He like, or a couple times, he did something like this. And then he played c3 here. Maybe someone can correct me if I'm wrong. And then against b6, he played c4. Because now black had committed to this. And so now this position was like worse for black because like of this weakness. I think that's what happened. And then, okay, if black played c6, then he had some other idea about how to use the extra tempo. But he did that a couple times. I'm sure they've since figured out how to deal with it. Is c6 necessary in this line? No, not at all. I think on every move, pretty much black has options. You can play d6, you can play c5. Like here, c5 is very common as well. So yeah, there are lots of different options for black to play along the lines.